I'm wondering if you believe that it's possible to have healthy hierarchies in spirituality and spiritual communities.
Yeah. I love this question. Yes, definitely. It feels a bit similar to like, is it possible to have healthy parenting or healthy schools or something? There's a way where it's almost like the format is inherently a bit restrictive. Like there's no perfect parents, there's no perfect school. But there's kind of like a full spectrum from really abusive and traumatizing right up to super supportive and kind of like setting people on their way. And yeah, there's also sort of different phases. I really like the school analogy, because there's like, with spirituality, there's kind of like a level where people need basic skills in a sort of like first school kind of way, just like really basic meditation practices. And that requires a certain type of power dynamic. And then there's a sort of high school version. And then there's the kind of like university, PhD level sort of way of learning. And so, yeah, a lot of the, pretty much all the teaching that I do is sort of like PhD level. It's people who've really gone through their process and are kind of like individuating and finding their own voice and their own sort of thesis and their own, like, they're often becoming teachers or sharing things in the world. And that requires a certain type of power between teacher and student that's very different to the sort of earlier levels where there's more structure and more kind of like just being a bit more rigidity, I suppose, in the system. Yeah, so it feels like being able to sort of like have those open conversations is an important part. And then I think one key part where I do like to push back is the sense of with school and with parenting, there's like a clear objective, which is that it's not the sort of the adults like prerogative to keep the child under their control and to keep them in the system, to keep them like propping up the hierarchy.
Is that true? I feel like with some parents it is all about like,
sure,
how do I control this child?
Right. Yeah. But I guess that's maybe not the like healthy outcome. You want your child to become an adult and go into the world and live their life. And yeah, that to me feels like a sort of like one healthy metric of spirituality is like, are people being trained to be kept in a system and kept to be sort of subservient to the system, or are they being kind of like, yeah, encouraged out into wholeness, into individuation, and into like their own expression in the world?
Yeah. I mean that seems like a very, on some level, it's almost like an obvious point. It's like being a teacher, you should allow, like once the student has learned, like once you've taught them everything you could teach them, they should be able to go on their way and maybe find a new teacher. Or, I used to do some personal training. And for me, it was always like, how do I get this person to train themselves? How do I get them where they don't rely on me? Because that would be the success. Whereas I can see how in some spiritual communities and some spiritual teachers, it's like, I'm the guru and it's like, I need to have my power dynamic and you could never surpass me. That's pathological. And I guess this whole question of healthy hierarchies, it also kind of ties in with the question of expertise. And in most fields, whether it's medicine, law, or technology, we learn from teachers, those who have far more expertise and skills than us in a particular domain. And in some way, I think many of us use a similar orientation in order to learn meditation or spiritual practice. However, the difference in spirituality is that it's intensely personal and existential, and it's very difficult to like assess spiritual capacities or skills. We can watch a mathematician solve problems on a blackboard in front of us. Or, you could even watch a surgeon successfully complete operation, or a carpenter build furniture, but we don't see what is happening inside of a spiritual teacher's mind or heart. So how do you think about assessing the credibility of spiritual teachers and their expertise? And how important do you think a teacher is in spiritual development or awakening? And how do we balance this kind of trust between ourselves and a teacher? I mean, there's a lot there, but
totally. Yeah, this is a great question. And it's like, it feels like particularly potent for me because I've come up completely outside of tradition, outside of qualifications, outside of, I'm just like a free agent. It's like just my whole experiences were, I mean, I've had these sort of like key moments of finding certain things, like some I've mentioned and many more, and spiritual friends and people who've kind of been mentors for brief periods of time, but I've never really had like a teacher or a tradition that I was part of. It was always like the thing that I was looking for, the thing that I knew needed to come alive. I couldn't find the place that could happen. So it was almost like having to carve my own path. And and then realizing that part of that process is that there's something important that wants to be shared, and so starting to share it with people, and not being approved or kind of like signed off by anyone to do that. So that's part of it, is that it's anything that kind of then makes that process more rigid, like shuts down potential opportunity for things like that to happen. It's almost like, as someone who thrives in self-learning and self-teaching, and that, I guess that's the downside of any kind of like being more rigid around qualifications or how do we assess this. And then on the other side of that is that lots of people, I guess, I don't know, I guess kind of it like you say, it's like such a intimate part of people's experience that like, how do you choose who to trust to let in? And I think my sort of like short term advice to people is always really like deeply listen and check in with yourself, and like spend some time actually listening to how someone speaks, what the effect is on your body, on your heart, just like taking it in. Do some journaling after you've listened to someone speak, that sort of thing, and like really listen to the depths of your being and what you're hearing from someone, because I guess people can get it wrong and trust the wrong people, but starting from the place of like, you're your own source of trust on the path is good and empowering. And that's kind of like, I guess, where the main place I come from. And then I think from a more longer term perspective, I'm like dead keen on like, how can people's, like, is there a way to make this more kind of based on actual attainments and actual possibilities? Like, what are those things? So is it for example, doing more scientific research into how these things affect our body and measuring that, and then like looking at it from a scientific perspective, or is that too reductive? Because I have a strong sense that all of the things that I talk about in my experience would show up pretty clearly on various like ways of measuring. But is that do you then lose the magic of the thing, which is kind of the most important thing to me, is that we're showing up in a sort of like wholehearted, in like way that is about integrity and emotions and being honest, and but then is that bit too manipulable. And yeah, like it's a very it's a question that is super interesting to me in the long term. Like, how can this be more clear, more open, more empowering for people to make choices, while also respecting the kind of like mystery and the harder to define things.
Yeah, what's coming up for me with measuring is you could probably like right they're already doing this kind of research where they're putting people into scanners and like long time meditators and seeing like, oh, the default mode network is like just shuts down. I mean, they were doing something with Daniel Ingram, and like his default mode network was just shut down, and he had the only way that he could turn on was if he like was thinking about negative things, for some period of time. And for those that don't know, the default mode network is the part of the brain that's like responsible for the self narrative and this whole sense of self. But you can't. I don't think that we've gotten to a point where, and I don't know if we'll ever will, where you could put somebody into a scanner and see their ethics light up. Like, oh, this person is very ethical. So perhaps there is a utility in the sense of like, okay, this person does have concentration ability, or they've rewired their brain in this place where they don't have like a lot of this mind identification. But you wouldn't be obviously able to check, is this person ethical? And that's more of like being in connection with them. And how do you feel inside your body? How does this person act? Trusting them a little bit and seeing how that goes. I think there's also the piece of like, well, how do you know if you could trust somebody? You trust them. Like, that's the only way. There's always a risk to it. It's just with the spiritual teacher, that risk can be really high. And
yeah, totally. Yeah, I think there's something in there's something in networks of, when you talk about trust, there's something in networks of trust where I think, for example, with the course, that's also a sort of a feeling of like, these are people that I trust and who trust me, and we're kind of building like a loose affiliation of like, hey, these are some other places that you could go and explore these things where the content you're going to get is honest, it's straightforward, it's helpful, and that sort of like network effect of I think is important as well.